Hey y'all, this is Sandy, and first I want to make an explanation about the United Kingdom and World War I. In a previous video about Lovecraft's peers, I made some statements which either some British viewers misinterpreted, or more likely that I made the statements in such a way that they were subject to misinterpretation. So let me make it clear. I don't think Britain started World War I. I think that the blame for World War I was the Austrian Foreign Ministry and a subsect of the Serbs. The British were dragged kicking and screaming into it. I also do not think that the British are responsible for starting the Nazis and communists. I think World War I there's a clear chain between World War I and the Nazis and the communists. Okay, I admit the chain wasn't inevitable. It could have been broken up at any point, led to something different, presumably something better, because what could be worse, right? But there is that linked chain. What I was complaining about really was two things. First, the British thought the war was a great crusade. Now, that's not unique to Britain. Everyone thought the war was a great crusade. But the British used that crusade idea, the British wartime culture, to shame people like William Hope Hodgson into going to the front line and dying to save the world for their crusade. And World War I is like the worst crusade ever. I mean, the world is obviously, with any war, better off not having it. But what good came out of World War I? I guess the breakup of Austria-Hungary and the fall of the Tsar. Of course, the Tsar was later replaced by a worse regime, but the fall of the Tsar was nonetheless a good thing. World War II, also presented as a great crusade, was. I mean, what happened in World War II made a difference to the world, potentially made it better. World War I, not so much. So anyway, that's what I wanted to say. So my British viewers, that's my explanation. I hope it makes sense. Now, let's talk about horror. Horror is a delicate genre. Now, usually, when you mix horror with another genre, you end up switching genres, okay, to that new one. For example, the movie Alien is a straight horror movie, okay? Its sequel, Aliens, is an action movie with some horror notes. All right. Well, actually, a lot of horror notes, but it has the horror notes, but it's still an action movie. It feels like an action movie. It's presented like an action movie. You feel action. Now, the movie Rodan, a less good movie, the same idea, starts out kind of creepy and horrific. There's these killer insects. There's a giant egg underground. What's that going to be? But once the giant pterodactyl shows up, it's not horror anymore. It's a kaiju movie. Okay. Now, a really good example of this are two of my favorite movies, which are The Vineyard and Big Trouble in Little China, which have a lot of things in common. They both have James Hong as the villain. So that's a reason to watch The Vineyard, no matter what. They both have strong horror elements. They both have kung fu fights. They both have both Western characters, Americans, and Chinese. Okay, they both have horror-type plots underlying them. They have bad guys using black magic to further their ends. Though in The Vineyard, there's also mad science. Now, The Vineyard stays horror. The action never creeps into the foreground. The kung fu fights are not the driving force of the movie. They're threats because the best kung fu guys, I guess the best kung fu guys are the bad guys in both these movies, but the action doesn't go into the foreground. It stays horror. But Big Trouble is clearly an action movie, though again, it has horror elements. Now, this isn't bad. I'm just saying action and adventure, when they're added to horror, become action and adventure movies with horror touches. But there's one big exception. Surprisingly, it's comedy. You can actually combine horror with comedy effectively, and it doesn't have to destroy the horror. Of course it can, when used effectively or effectively to produce a pure comedy, but adding comedy can sometimes even enhance the horror without destroying the comedy. Let's talk about how this happens. Now, I first learned this connection between comedy and horror when I was watching the original King Kong for the first time. I was a college student. I was with a whole bunch of other college students that were all in a film class. We watched King Kong. Now, in the early part of the movie, there's this long chase sequence through the swamp and jungle, which is portrayed fairly horrifically. And there's a brontosaurus chewing people up. There's attacks by dinosaurs. There's Kong flipping guys off the log into the ground. It goes on and on. And what happened is this chase is like, 10 minutes long or so. And by the end of it, it's very tense. The people in the audience, these film students, started to laugh and giggle, not because they thought it was funny, but because the tension was so much they had to have an outlet, and the outlet was a nervous laugh. Okay, you have to have an outlet to your horror. You can't just sit there and be constantly scared. That's why horror novels are usually less scary than short stories. You can't keep up constant terror for 300 pages. You have to have gaps. It's why, in my opinion, Stephen King's short stories are scarier than his novels. It's also why his shorter novels are usually scarier than his long one. It's why King's short story, Crouch End, is scarier than his novel From a View at Gate, which in turn is scarier than his long novel, The Stand. Now, I'm not saying The Stand is a bad book, but it's not super frightening to me, okay? So even in a good horror movie, there are humorous moments, such as where Harry Dean Stanton and Yaphet Kotto complain about their work and their pay. They're funny guys. They're likable. There's fun things going on. But later, your payoff is that these funny, likable guys get killed horribly. It really makes you concerned, right? In fact, a lot of horror movies, they have the quips and jokes that the slasher movie villains do. Freddy from Nightmare on Elm Street always has a joke when he kills a victim, but it's not a comedy, right? Jason from Friday the 13th is mute, but he can get involved in funny situations sometime. In Psycho 2, there's the awesome moment where our hero opens the kitchen drawer and there's a great big knife in it. And there's nothing said. He doesn't pull out the knife and stab him. It's just there, and there's like thinking about it. So I don't want to talk about incidental humor added to horror movies. I think any horror movie can have a little bit of incidental humor. I'm going to talk about an actual horror comedy, sometimes called black comedy. It's not necessarily the same thing. So I'm going to talk about a bunch of them. And let me say something else. I actually prefer horror to horror comedy. Horror comedy to me is generally a weaker genre. That's not true of everyone. I know it's not true of my editor here, Edgar. Hey, Edgar. But you might be one of them. But it doesn't mean the horror comedy is something I never want to watch. But it's just that I like horror better. So I maybe not as well versed in this. But then when I think about it, I actually am pretty well versed in it because I've seen so many. So let's talk about what makes a horror comedy work. And there's one big rule that I think is super important. In good horror comedy, the humans can be as funny as you like, realistically funny, not like Three Stooges, but, like realistically funny humans. But the monsters need to be genuinely monstrous. Of course, the monsters could get put into a funny situation, but fundamentally, the monsters are straight up monsters, not parodies, not funny versions of themselves. The killers in Scream, which has some humor elements, I wouldn't call it a comedy exactly, but the killers in Scream are trying to mimic slasher movies. That sets up the comedy elements, but they're full-on evil slasher villains, right? But because this need for the monsters to not be funny is necessary for horror comedy, that's why the movie The Munsters, The Toxic Avenger, The Naked Monster, these aren't horror. They're straight up comedy. They just use horror as a sort of trampoline to reach up and grab jokes and pull them down, okay? So if you use real, actually dangerous monsters, you get the full effect. I'm going to talk about a bunch of movies that are great horror comedies. It's easier for me than trying to pontificate about what a horror comedy is, especially since the fact is, if you go and Google horror comedy, you're not going to be able to find a good horror comedy that way. It's going to have some lame things that came out in the last 5 or 6 years, and you deserve more than that. You need to be able to go back and find some great horror comedies. Here are some. First off, a really old one, 1931, I think, The Old Dark House. Okay, it's in a creepy old dark house. It's got Boris Karloff and Charles Laughton, and the house is full of crazy people. And they aren't actually crazy in a funny way. They're crazy in a dangerous way. There's a straight up murderer crazy guy. Boris Karloff plays the butler who, when he gets he's mute, when he's drunk, he gets violent, and it's played threateningly. But the guests who are stuck at this house are funny guys. Charles Laughton could be really comic when he wanted to. I showed this movie to a bunch of my friends, and they had never seen it, and they're watching it, and they loved it. I loved it too. I think it is better than the original Frankenstein, better than the original Dracula. It's one of the best horror movies of all of the 1930s, even though it's also a comedy. So check out The Old Dark House. It's also now available in an awesome Blu-ray, so which is cool, right? So, okay, now go to one which is trying to be a straight-up comedy, but still becomes a horror comedy, and this is Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. Now, one of the reasons this manages to be a horror as well as a comedy is that it uses the best actors possible for the monsters. Bela Lugosi is Dracula. Lon Chaney Jr. is the Wolfman. They didn't get Boris Karloff, so they got Glenn Strange to play the monster, but Glenn Strange played the monster a couple of times, so he's adept at it. And they had a lady Frankenstein because, I guess they didn't want to have a man. Also, that way, let her vamp Lou Costello. Costello is in danger in this because the evil monsters, Dracula wants to take out his brain and put it in the Frankenstein monster to make it work for him, which is kind of a funny thing because that idea is that Costello is such an idiot, that then Bella can control the monster better, right? But you think about it, it's actually a pretty horrifying plot. It's just there's funny elements to it. I watched this with my granddaughter Madeline, who is 10, and I do not show her a lot of super scary movies. I'm fine with her being 10 and having a 10-year-old's view, but she wants to watch scary movies with the grandpa, but I try to tone it down. So I asked her in Abbott and Costello versus Frankenstein if it was scary, and she said not too scary except when Abbott is in the attic and the Frankenstein monster's there on a throne and it's dark, and Abbott sits on his lap thinking it was, not realizing the monster was there. So that was also a funny scene, but it was also scary. So there you go. So there it is. Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein, better than you might think. Next, we have the killer clowns from outer space. Now, this is unusual because it seems to violate my rule that the monsters, in fact, are funny, but the monsters are funny because they're clowns. They're doing clown gags to kill people. They're wrapping them up in cotton candy, they're punching their heads off with boxing gloves. They're eating them with shadow puppets, doing all kinds of clown things. In fact, the movie hilariously says, maybe our knowledge of clowns came from these aliens that came in the past, which is the most bogus scientific explanation I've ever heard. So it's great. So the killer clowns are actually evil and killing people and kind of scary if you're scared of clowns, which I am not, but some people are. So the Chiodo brothers who made this had plans to go on and make more clown gags because you never run out. They can go to the clown planet, have clown and wildlife and stuff. But they didn't because of lawyers. Instead of us being now on Killer Clowns number 9, we are on Killer Clowns number 1 still, and they never got to do any more. So too bad. We could have had more of those. So we're kind of moving down towards movies that become less comic, but are still have comic elements. And now we're going to The Deadly Spawn, one of my favorite alien invasion movies from the 1980s. It's a wonderful movie, and even better, the monster is not sentient. I love non-sentient invasions. Now, it's not as funny as some of these, but it's not entirely, remember, it's not a comedy, it's a horror comedy. Now, the thing I like about this, the monsters are mindless things that just go and eat, but they do get into some funny situations, like one of them crawls into a blender and gets turned into salad dressing. And one of the really cool things about The Deadly Spawn is that the human characters aren't idiots. I mean, they make decisions based on insufficient information, so they do things that are wrong, but they didn't know it at the time, and they freak out, realistically, but they don't just do straight up dumb numbnuts things, which is kind of refreshing in a horror movie, especially a cheap alien invasion movie. What a concept. Check out The Deadly Spawn. I think you'll like it. Now, I know you're expecting me to talk about Shaun of the Dead, but everyone's seen it, and yeah, the zombies in that are straight up, except for one, which we won't get to, but most of you have probably seen Hot Fuzz. Maybe you haven't noticed the genuinely unsettling horror story at the core, a sort of cult. Of course, you have to think about it to realize how terrifying the idea is. The movie keeps you moving so fast, you don't really notice. But nonetheless, that concept is driving the movie's plot. Now, Hot Fuzz is also a little different because there's not actually a monster. The bad guy is a person, and as such, that person is sometimes funny. It still works. There's genuinely creepy reveals when they find corpses, things like that, find out who the bad guys are. It works for me, Hot Fuzz. If you haven't seen it, you should. Now, we're going to go on a takeoff of a slasher movie, Tucker and Dale vs. Evil. If you have not seen this, go see it on Amazon or whatever right away. There is a bad guy in it, and he's pretty much portrayed, once he shows up near the end of the movie, as a straight-up, honest-to-God slasher. He's not funny once he does that, but the other characters more than make up for it. And I won't go into much detail on it, but but especially if you're like from the South, this is fabulous. So, like I am. Now, one of Peter Jackson's very first films was Dead Alive. I think it's called Brain Dead in New Zealand. And it is actually my favorite movie by him. Sorry, Peter. I know you've done a lot of great movies, but this is it, Dead Alive. So it's super gory. And a fun fact is when I showed this to John Romero from id Software, he blanched and ran out of the room during the tea party scene. It was too much for him. So again, zombies are evil and bad, very funny characters. This is a great horror comedy. Maybe my second favorite of all time. We'll get into the first later on. We have Monster Squad. Now, Monster Squad is interesting because you have a bunch of tween kids fighting the classic Universal monsters, portrayed in a lawsuitable way. So you have the creature from the Black Lagoon. They just call the creature. They have the mummy. They have the Wolfman, who is played like the regular Wolfman. He doesn't want to turn into the werewolf. He wants to, he's lock me up. He says the Frankenstein monster and Dracula. They're all there, ready to go. It doesn't have the Phantom of the Opera, but I guess he'd be hard to fit in. And the kids go after him. It's funny and it's scary. Now, they really cared about their origins in this. They tried really hard to make it right. Dracula wears that dumb medallion that Bela Lugosi wears. I guess it wasn't dumb in the 1890s or whatever he got it, But here's an example of how much they cared. In the original Dracula movie, when you go into the castle, there's an armadillo. Now, at the time, armadillos didn't have as wide a range as they do now in the United States. They've spread. They're one of the animals that have done better with human interference. And also, they probably weren't as well known in places like New York, California. So it was this odd thing. People would look at that and say, what's that, an armored rat? An insect? I can't tell what that is. What's that awful thing? Of course, if you lived in Texas, it was like, look, an armadillo. Why is that in Dracula's castle? But the point is that today, of course, everyone knows what an armadillo is. And when you go into Dracula's castle at the start of Monster Squad, there's an armadillo because they know there's armadillos in his castle. Now, of course, for us now, it's hilarious, especially if you watch the old movies. It's a funny thing, but it's a subtle funny because they don't draw attention to it. They just have it there walking around. Also, I'd like to point out that in the original 1931 Dracula, there's a Jerusalem cricket that climbs out of a little bug-sized coffin. A lot of people think it's a bee. It's not. It's a Jerusalem cricket. Doesn't matter. It's a bug in a tiny bug coffin. How adorable is that? Oh yeah, also there's a possum. Dracula has a pet possum. What a castle, It's unusual, but all his things he has there are from America, but I guess, who knows how that happened. A horror comedy that I think was really stellar, but which had serious problems was Slither. I love Slither. It's a great alien invasion movie. In common with all my favorite alien invasion movies, the aliens are in fact not sentient, though they gain sentience eventually by, bonding with humans. It has a really complicated alien life cycle that they don't ever spell out, but you see it happen and you work it out, It came at a time when I guess people didn't want horror comedies because it nearly killed the production company that made it, which is sad. And it still, I don't think, has made back its nickel. So if you are interested in Slither, I recommend that you pay for it on a pay site or get a DVD and help get these guys to reimburse on it, because I want them to make more movies like that, and maybe they won't ever, or maybe someone won't. Okay, I've mentioned slashers a couple times. Now, back in the 70s and 80s, there was a thing with slashers where to make your cheap, nasty slasher, you said, hey, let's base it on a holiday, because Black Christmas and Halloween were the bomb. So you had My Bloody Valentine, you had July 4th, there was Happy Birthday to Me, a bunch of slasher movies kind of based on holidays. But some guys had the genius plan for their cheap, crappy slasher to base it on April Fool's Day. Okay? Now, it's just a cheap slasher, but man, they outdid themselves to emulate the idea of the Halloween, and they fulfill the April Fool's idea. I won't say any more about it. If you like cheap, crappy slashers like I do, check out April Fool's Day. If you don't, you can skip it, because, there's, although I still recommend Tucker and Dale versus Evil despite it being a slasher. But April Fool's Day, it's everything you wanted in a slasher based on April Fool's Day. Now, I talked earlier about Scream, mentioned how it's a very self-aware horror movie. There's another one, even more so, which is There's Nothing Out There. Also, There's Nothing Out There had a budget of $100. It's very self-aware. Everyone in the movie, except for one guy, acts like characters in a horror movie. They don't think there's a monster. They poo-poo anything. They're just out there to be in the country cabin and have sex, right? So there's one guy extra. There's three couples, and there's this one extra guy who doesn't have a girl with him. And he's the one that knows about monster movies. So when he realizes he's the only guy without a girl, he's the odd man. He's the expendable guy. He panics. He knows he's doomed. He's trying to do things that stop him from happening. It's quite funny. Here's an example of the sort of thing that happens. There's a scene where he and one of the girls goes into the basement because they heard a scary sound, might be a monster in the basement. So they go down into the basement and they're looking around, and suddenly this cat falls out of the top of the screen into the girl's arms. She goes, oh, look, it was just the kitty that was making the sound. Nice kitty, let's go. And then the guy is like, wait, where'd the cat come from? How did it? And he's like, but the girl doesn't notice. She just goes out and he's like, what is going on here? So it's pretty funny. So I recommend that. And now I'm going to move into a realm that you may not be aware of for horror comedies, which is, it turns out that there's a lot of really good horror comedies that are not made in the United States. housu is one of them. Now, Japan has a history of weird horror and actually weird stuff in general. One of their very weirdest is the movie housu. Now, housu is not a Japanese word. It is a Japanese way of trying to say the word house. So it's house. It's super bizarre. Like, there's guys that turn into bunches of bananas. One-way trip. You don't come back from being bananas. There's a piano that eats people. There's like a giant wall that spits blood. It's like really bizarre. One of the things is I'm not sure if it's a joke or it's Japanese culture, but there's these 5 teenage girls that go up to the haunted house. Okay. And they're Japanese teenage girls. They're kind of interchangeable, except they give them each a personality trait so you can tell them apart. So like one knows kung fu, and one of them is good with makeup, and one of them likes playing the piano, and one of them, it took me a long time to figure out in the movie, but she's supposed to be the fat one, the chubby one. Because the other girls talk about how she's chubby, and I'm looking at her, she's like maybe 5 pounds more than the others. She looks just like another Japanese girl. But then I realized eventually they always show her eating, and her cheeks are slightly rounder. Not rounder in a I'm overweight way, just like rounder. So that was really weird. I'm not sure if they're making fun of the of Japanese teen girls by thinking she's chubby, or if some guy who knows. It was funny to me. It's something very strange, housu. I'm not sure if it's a comedy exactly, but I think everyone should experience it. Also, Criterion released a really good version on Blu-ray, and I think it's on Amazon Prime on Shudder. So, now, a better source for horror comedy than Japan, however. Japan has a lot of comedies with horror elements, like Frankenstein Girl versus Vampire Girl, but you want actual horror comedy with the clean mix. Hong Kong's the go-to place. For years, they added humor to its horror. So this is Close Encounters of the Spooky Kind, starring one of my favorite kung fu guys, Sammo Hung. Now, it has ghosts. It has a Chinese version of Bloody Mary, the gal in the mirror that gets you. It has hopping vampires. It has a sorcerer's battle. Actually, you might have the greatest sorcerer battle of all time, rivaling the one at the end of The Raven. It turns out that if your altar is higher, you have an advantage in the sorcerer battle. So they're both trying to build up their altar on these ladders to be up high to fight. It's really good. I like it a lot. The kung fu fighting is fabulous. It's funny. It's scary. Maybe not too scary because Chinese horror doesn't always translate to English, but I like it a lot. Now, later, Mr. Hung funded what might be the greatest horror comedy ever made. I mentioned that I had a greatest. Maybe my second favorite of all time. We'll get into the first later on. And this might be it. Mr. Vampire. It's amazing. I got my hands on this about 20 years ago, and it literally changed my life. When I first got it, I sat down with my 4 sons and said, let's watch Mr. Vampire. And they were like, yay, let's do it. So we sat down, and my wife said, what are you watching? And we said, Mr. Vampire. And her reaction was, no way am I watching a movie named Mr. Vampire. I'll be upstairs folding clothes or doing other things. So we said, okay, bye, Mom. So she went upstairs. So we're watching the movie, and we're all laughing like crazy. And there is horror. It's not a horror comedy. I mean, it's not a comedy. It's a horror comedy, but the funny parts are super funny. I actually fell off my chair laughing, and my sons are laughing. And a half hour in, my wife storms down the stairs and said, okay, I got to see this. Go back to the start. And we were all happy to do that and watch the first half hour over again because it was so great. Every time someone visits and sees my movie collection, they say, let's watch something. My go-to thing, especially if they want to see an Asian movie, is to yank out Mr. Vampire. It never fails. Everyone loves it. I must have seen it 30 or 40 times by now. It is great. The best horror comedy of all time, in Sandy's opinion. The vampire is always scary and super dangerous. The kung fu, the comedy, the great actors, the sets, the interaction between the characters is all stellar. It's perfect. Now, it spawned about 15 sequels in Hong Kong, so if you want, you can spend a lot of time watching Chinese hopping vampire movies. I know the idea of a Chinese hopping vampire might seem inherently funny to you if you haven't seen one. They're not. The hopping part isn't as funny when you see it, right? They're pretty scary vampires, but the comedy is so strong in these. In fact, there's even an American hopping vampire movie, sort of. It's The Boneyard from the 1990s. It's a fine, fine film, which I highly recommend. Phyllis Diller is in it, and her poodle, Floofsums. Maybe not Phyllis Diller's actual poodle, but there is a poodle, Floofsums, and she is great. The poodle is great. The characters are great. It's all set in a morgue. It costs about a nickel to film, who cares? It's got what you want in a horror comedy. Strongly recommend The Boneyard. Now, I'm going to go to one of my favorite zombie movies of all time. It's Biozombie. Now, I said I usually prefer straight horror to comedy, but this is so good, even though it's a horror comedy, that it rises to the rank of some of my top zombie movies. Not my very top one, but it's up there in the first 3 or 4. Now, incidentally, Hong Kong horror has something I hate, which is that they have the worst DVD covers of all time. It's always a bunch of people's faces with random bits kind of washed out and maybe some nonsense words. Terrible DVDs. Anyway, back to Biozombie. Biozombie is great. It has good actors. It has funny plots. The zombies are evil. It does have a good zombie who remembers that he has a crush on this girl, but he's still totally a zombie. Like, the scene I show here shows him serving people sushi to other zombies because it happens in a mall and he was a sushi chef. It's a really great video type movie. For example, they have a scene where all the characters who have survived are shown rotating with their stats showing up, like a video game. There's also other renditions of it, like at one point a character picks up a gun, he finds a gun, he goes, yeah, I got a gun. And then suddenly icons on the screen flash showing no ammo. And he goes, oh, dang. He doesn't say there's no ammo. He just, like, the icon's there and he throws it down, no ammo. It's right out of the blue. This movie made me cry twice. It made me cry once from tears of laughter and once from tears of genuine pathos when I felt sad for something that was happening to the screen. It was like touching. It's good. Okay. Now, we'll go to a Thai movie called Sars Wars. This came out obviously during the SARS 4 epidemic, and I guess they thought Sars Wars would be a good name, which it's not. But one of the cool things about this, I mean, the Thai don't have any money to make movies, right? So when in Sars Wars wants to show something and they don't have the special effects budget to do it, they use cartoons. Anyway, the movie's funny, it's scary, it has a callback to Captain Hook's crocodile. It's got some funny moments, like one of the heroes pulls out the green light sword, which is really amazing, and it has this long green blade, kind of like a lightsaber almost, but and he's flashing around killing the zombies, and suddenly in the middle of the fight he goes, pew, down to 0, and she goes, what's wrong? It's out of batteries. Then there's a subplot of trying to find batteries so they can power up the sword again and use it. It's surprisingly good. Thai movies are in general pretty great. So this went longer than I expected. I guess I know a lot of horror comedy. I need to stop before the video goes on forever. I keep thinking of more like Italy's Cemetery Man or Magic Cop from China. Like I said, Google isn't helpful. If you look up best horror comedy, you're going to get boring old standbys, not the cool weird stuff. I mean, Mr. Vampire beats the pants off any Western horror comedy I've ever seen, and you won't find, probably not going to come up when you Google horror comedy. Anyway, that is my tale for you about horror comedy. My editor, Edgar, suggested I do this, and I did. So it's your fault, Edgar.